Oh, Haley's already in. So, oh, there she is. Oh, I didn't let her in. I lied. She was waiting. Yeah, all the classes are on Zoom. No, it's Zoom is a broadcasting preferentially, so you can't really record without broadcasting. Okay. Yeah, like if you're, a lot of times what'll happen is the students that I'm hearing about that are getting sick are able to Zoom in. So yeah, that's the only reason why that'll probably disappear as the semesters go on, because we've already got a backlog of recordings, and so this is probably getting to the last couple of semesters where Zoom's going to be a standard. It'll probably just be sort of individual. So like if I hear students, saying I'm not going to be there, is there a way I can get to it? Then typically what will happen is we'll either be able to set up a separate Zoom so that they can join, or it'll just be like, well, we've got the recording. So the recording is basically it. Yeah. It comes in handy. But I mean, part of the problem is like with my general bio students, it does tend to start getting abused a little bit because students just start getting lazy and start showing up. And then when that happens, then that's when Zoom's going to be shut down and be replaced with recordings. So that's the reason why I say this is probably going to be one of the last semesters where it's basically up as a standard. And it'll probably just be individual at that point. So, because the recordings largely are the same thing, they basically cover the same situation. Okay, so let's go ahead and dig in here, and see if we can't finish, or at least get a healthy run at finishing 5. Get a little bit of 6 started here. So we talked a little bit about some of the function of the integument system. Now we want to kind of talk about the half part, right? So we talked about some of the stuff we kind of know already, right? Protection, things like that. Now we're going to talk about some of the things that we tend not to talk about as much, but it's still certainly important, right? Obviously, one of the functions of the integument system is sensation. So we talked a little bit about that, right? So you got all these different sensors in there: temperature, pressure, pain, touch, heat, cold, things like that. Obviously, these two are redundant. Temperature is heat and cold, and everything in between. And of course, the other groups that kind of go together: pressure, pain, touch, those all go together as well. And so this is all part of your sensation. And so this kind of helps you to interact with the outside world, sort of interface with what's going on in your environment, so that you can kind of understand a little bit better what's happening in your external environment, so you know better how to sort of arrange your life so that you don't, say, for instance, fry in the sun, right? Or that you can take your hand off of the burning stove before you get a hamburger, right? Okay, that was bad. That was intentional. See, when they're not intentional, they're great. When they're intentional, it's like tomato time. But anyway, so the other big one that we probably don't talk about enough, right, is temperature regulation. So this is actually a big strategy for how you regulate your temperature. So we've talked a little bit already about the sweat glands, right? And there's so the sweat glands is one strategy. Actually, if you take a look at the sweat glands, this is basically like an evaporative cooling system, right? I mean, how many of you guys have a swamp cooler? A swamp cooler, or like an evaporative cooler?
Giant box on top of your.
That's how you know I don't.
Okay.
So you don't have it. So you have central AC, right? So the swamp cooler is basically like a giant box you'll see on houses in neighborhoods, right? And basically what it does is evaporative cooling. The way that it works is it basically leverages one of the properties of water, which if you took general bio, you might remember. If you haven't, then I'll tell you what it is, right? So water has, one of its properties of its structure is it has the capacity to absorb a lot of heat without changing temperature. And it's something called specific heat. It's a variation of heat capacity. All materials have this, right? Some have a very low heat capacity, like metals, for instance, because they're very conductive. And some have a very high heat capacity. So if you have a high heat capacity, what that means is you can absorb a lot of energy and not change temperature, right? Metal are a very bad example, right? Because if you put something that's metal out in the middle of the sun on a hot day, that metal gets hot quickly, right? That's because it has a very low heat capacity. It cannot absorb that energy without changing temperature very, very quickly. Well, what swamp cooling does, or evaporative cooling does, is it basically leverages that property of water to your advantage. So what it does is basically, if you take a look, and evaporative cooling is very simple, very simple. All it has is just basically a rotary fan motor that basically circulates the air. And then it has little, yeah, right. And it has like a little hose that feeds water into some pads that are designed to be soaked in the water. So the idea is that the hot air on your roof will come through the water. It'll get absorbed by the water, but the water won't change temperature. So after going through the water, the air gets cooled down because the water sucks the heat out of the air. And then that's cooler air is what gets blown through your house. If you've ever actually stood in front of an evaporative cooler, the air coming out is actually quite cool, surprisingly so, right? It's, by the way, the same idea that people used to use back in the day before air conditioning, when they used to like take sheets and get them wet and then hang them up like in the house. That's basically an evaporative cooler type of a strategy. It worked quite effectively. That's also, yeah, right? So similar sort of thing. So your sweat is like an evaporative cooler, right? So basically what happens is you basically coat yourself in this liquid. Now what happens when you do this is, remember, your sweat is in the dermis, right? So the dermis is basically where you're going to have all of your blood vessels, and in your blood is where your heat is. So basically blood is hot, right? And so your sweat glands, which are making the sweat, are basically in and amongst these hot blood vessels, and they're absorbing the heat from your blood. And so your blood is basically shedding that heat into your sweat. So then when you basically put the sweat out on the surface of your skin, it's holding and harboring a certain amount of heat energy that you absorb from your blood system. So when a cool breeze comes along, what happens to the cool breeze? You get a heat transfer, right? Because the idea is if your sweat is hotter than the breeze, then there's a natural heat transfer from hot to cold. The heat will basically shed into the air, into the breeze, leaving an absence of heat behind, which we sense as a cold sensation. So this is the reason why we actually feel. So when we feel cool, like we get that little cool puff of air on a hot summer day, that cool feeling that we feel is actually our body sensing the loss of heat from our skin, typically due to sweat. Okay, so basically that air just picks it all up. And so that's how you essentially get rid of excess heat. So for instance, here you can see in your dermis, you can see you have lots of blood. You have these large capillaries here that are going to be basically engorged in this hot blood. And on a hot day, when you need to get rid of this blood, you can shunt this blood toward the surface of the skin so that you can shed more of that. Now, it'll immediately either radiate off directly, that's radiation, or it will basically move into, absorb into the sweat, which will then evaporate off as sweat. And so both of them will work. So this is basically like a hot day. You're offloading that extra body core temperature so that you can maintain body core and keep yourself cool. On a cold day, you do just the opposite. You shut off these little capillaries near your skin, the surface of your skin, and you keep that nice warm blood internal. And so this is like if it's a cool day or if you're not needing to shed extra heat. And so this is one of the reasons why, if you take a look at somebody who's been out in the sun, sometimes they kind of start to look flushed, not sunburned, but kind of flushed, a little red. That's because all those capillaries near the surface of the skin are getting engorged in blood. So their skin is actively shedding heat, right? So that's basically what's happening. That's also the reason why people start to get red when they get active, right? So they kind of like run around and they kind of get that flushed color. And so that's basically what's happening. You're shedding that excess heat to try to keep your core body temperature the same. Because remember, when you're talking about core body temperature, it comes from really two places, right? Skeletal muscles and metabolism is where that core body temperature comes from. But that temperature is circulated through the blood. So if you're actively exercising, your core body temperature is going up, but you don't want to pass out, right? So you don't want your core body temperature getting above 37 degrees Celsius, because otherwise you're talking about fever territory, and we all know how physically active we feel when we're feverish, right? Which is like not, right? We just basically want to fall apart. So in order to keep your body temperature the same, you have to shed that extra heat that your engines are making because you're actively working out, okay? So the other big one is vitamin D, right? So we talked a little bit already about vitamin D production, right, before. So this is just kind of like a little bit of an addition to that. So we all know that you need to be out in the sun to get your vitamin D, right? So this all begins in the skin. The purpose of vitamin D, which we talked about before, is to aid in calcium absorption, which is the reason why you need vitamin D. Calcium is obviously important for lots of different reasons. We'll learn a little bit about this in the bone physiology chapter, the importance of calcium. And also in the muscle chapter, which is the one after that, we'll also learn about the importance of calcium as well. So calcium is important for a lot of tissues across the board. Vitamin D itself, yes?
Oh, I was just gonna ask, are we gonna need to remember that it's Ca2PO and then
Phosphate?
phosphate?
Yeah, you just want to remember that as phosphate.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, because that'll be important because that's actually part of the bone matrix.
Okay.
And so we'll need to really pin down our phosphate and our calcium. Yeah. Yes, that's correct. Ca2. So actually, it should be written. It's a little bit of a typo there. It should be written Ca plus 2 because it adopts a 2 plus ion. That's its ionic state. That's phosphate. Yeah. So that's calcium and phosphate. That's just the chemical, the designation, the chemical formula for calcium and phosphate. Yeah. Yeah. So the final hormone. So basically what you actually have as your final physiologically active vitamin D is actually what we refer to as calcitriol, which is a hormone produced by your kidneys, and it's critical in calcium homeostasis and kidney function, things like that. But basically what happens is there's a little bit of a stepwise process before you get to calcitriol. So what does calcitriol do? First of all, it will allow you to be able to take up calcium and phosphate, right? Because it is a co-absorbent for calcium and phosphate. So if you need calcium and phosphate, which you need, then you need to absorb it from your food, right? And then calcitriol will help to stimulate that so you can get that. Those. And what do you use them for? It's for your bony matrix, right? So your bony matrix, what sets your bones apart from your cartilage is the calcium phosphate, the mineralization component of bones. That's what kind of hardens bones. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that forms here in just a second. But calcitriol is also important in calcium homeostasis, so making sure you have good homeostatic levels of calcium. So that's the reason why it stimulates the reduction of calcium loss from the kidney. So this is a situation where you're trying to increase your blood calcium levels by producing calcitriol in the kidneys. And so like if you're low in calcium, you're calcium deficient, then what's going to happen is you're going to need calcitriol, that is final vitamin D, in order to keep your calcium in homeostatic levels. Okay? And the way it does that is by basically hanging on to the calcium that you do have. You don't dump it in your kidney, you don't dump it in your urine stream, right? And then the calcium that you're eating it basically stimulates you to absorb it better. So what you are eating, do a better job of getting it in. That should increase your blood levels as well. Okay. And so this is an important component of all of this. So what happens actually in the skin? Well, there's a lot of chemistry here. Don't get too hung up on it. I just want to sort of sketch it out so you can kind of see it in its kind of full stepwise system. Right. So in the skin, what you basically have is a molecule called 7-dehydrocholesterol. Right. So that's all that means is you've removed a hydrogen from the cholesterol molecule, which is a type of steroid. This calcitriol is a steroid. So we are talking about a steroid hormone here. And then it converts it to cholecalciferol, which you may recognize because if you take a vitamin D supplement, oftentimes if you look at the label, in parentheses, it'll say cholecalciferol. So it's giving you the form of vitamin D that gets converted in the skin. That's the supplement that you're taking. So that happens when UV radiation hits this molecule. Okay, so it'll take this dehydrocholesterol, convert it into cholecalciferol under the UV stimulus. And then ultimately what's going to happen is you're going to take that and you're going to release that into your blood, and it's going to go one of two places. So first of all, it's going to go either to the liver or it's going to go to the kidneys. And from these areas, it will then be converted into calcitriol. And it'll be converted calcitriol as needed typically, right? So if you don't need a lot of calcitriol because you're already very rich in calcium in your blood, then you don't need to make calcitriol because you don't need to retain more. You got way more than you need, right? In that case, you can just hang on to your cholecalciferol and you can just keep it until you need it. So for the time when you become a little calcium deficient.
So like for me, I have MS, so I have to have a lot of D. Is it because my body's not taking and making enough of this?
Cholecalciferol?
Yeah.
Yeah, it usually means that there's some sort of a breakdown in this particular area. So if you're taking a vitamin D supplement and it's a cholecalciferol type of supplement, then what that means is the beginning step, the conversion by UV radiation is broken. So as long as we can clear that step by giving you what you would have made
It's like
with
2,000
UV,
a day.
yeah, then you'd be like, your livers are fine. It's doing its job. If we give it cholecalciferol, it'll make calcitriol. If we give your livers cholecalciferol, it'll make calcitriol. That part works. So if you're taking a cholecalciferol supplement, then it's saying the first part is broken, but we'll feed you the second part, and then it'll be able to take it over from there. That's basically what's happening there. And for the most part, that should be enough to keep you well balanced in terms of your calcium. So ultimately then, when you take a look at this, obviously, you can see vitamin D deficiencies if you are covering yourself a lot, right? Because you need to get that sunlight in order to activate this first step. But, like we said, with supplementation, you can mask this effect a lot, right? Because obviously, if you have, especially in this area, it's a little bit of which devil do you want to pick, right? Because we live at altitude, which is melanoma country, right? And so the question is, well, do you want to uncover and risk getting melanoma, but you're going to do great with vitamin D? Or do you cover up and risk vitamin D deficiency, right, by protecting yourself from melanoma? So it's kind of a little bit of give or take. It depends on where you are and what you're doing. But like you can, so we can easily supplement. You can cover up, by the way. And save yourself from melanoma. That's the worst one, by the way. If you're wondering, vitamin D deficiency, melanoma, always pick the vitamin D deficiency every day. Right, because that one won't kill you unless it gets very severe, and we can treat it quickly with a supplement. But some sources, obviously, our sources would be supplements. That's the real source. I mean, let's face it, if you're eating your vitamin D, you're most likely taking a vitamin D supplement. That's just the world we live in. But if you're going for nutritional, then you're talking about things like liver, yum. I mean, who doesn't love liver and onions night, right? Personally, that I grew up on that. Every now and then, my dad did all the cooking in the house, and every now and then we'd have liver and onions night. And
I grew up on it.
yeah, this is how I learned how to love ketchup. Yeah, I had to have like a bottle of ketchup for each little bite of liver because I didn't like liver. And I had to,
It's like eating cardboard.
yeah. Well, it depends on how you cook it, but it's a very strong taste.
You get cow.
So the next lab is going to be an illustration and a demonstration of liver. So we're all going to eat liver. No, that would be very mean spirited. Yeah, sorry if you're a vegan, but yeah, no, yeah, I could never get, I'm not a fan of liver to this day. So as a kid, you eat what you got, and then yeah, that's how I learned how to love ketchup. It's a bottle of ketchup will just about put anything down. I learned that one the hard way.
Switch before next generally I think she's about to continue this conversation. Her face is bright red.
You guys are like, okay, so we'll just go ahead and forego the liver lab then next week, and we'll just do the lab exam. How about that? Is that okay? We'll save the liver lab for AMP2. Be like, so this is what it'd be like if you were Hannibal Lecter. Anyway, I love that. Okay, so this is basically the visual for what we just said, right? So basically the first step of it is obviously the conversion by UV, right? From dehydrocholesterol to your cholecalciferol precursor, right? That's going to be step one. And then your cholecalciferol will either go to your liver or to your kidneys and then convert it into your steroid hormone, calcitriol. Right? And so for the most part, and by the way, it's not like you have to get out there and sunbathe and like bake in the sun for days at a time to get this to work. I mean, this is something that's actually very, very efficient. Like just a little bit of sun exposure will do the trick. Will give you more than enough vitamin D to get you past it. Like maybe 30 minutes at that's good. And it's really, just like walking around just like a normal day is usually enough to get it. So it's not like you have to sort of plan to spend an entire day under the UV lamp in order to get this to work out. It's very sensitive. It's very efficient. Yeah. So theoretically, yes. Technically, no. It has to be like arms, legs, things like that, larger areas.
Stand outside like constantly, like everyday type of thing.
So the question is, do you have to stand outside constantly every day? And the answer is no. Honestly, you're probably getting enough vitamin D by just the amount of time you spend outside, even during the winter, which is where you'd likely see troughs in vitamin D. But even then, you're still probably outside enough, just like in shoveling the driveway, you're probably outside more than enough. Yeah, because it's not like, it's like, oh crap, I missed my vitamin D day today. That means I'm gonna die of rickets tomorrow, whatever it is, right? So that's not the way it works, right? I mean, so it's like, it's a cumulative thing. So if you miss your exposure time today, don't worry. If you get it tomorrow, you're good, right? It's not like, you're gonna be in desperate shape. It's gonna take a while, right? So you would have to be covered up for a while before you start really suffering profound effects of vitamin D deficiency. Yeah, and then like if you don't need injection, I mean, most vitamin D pills, which will be bundled with calcium and magnesium and things like that, those will oftentimes, you'll get those in a spectrum of different supplements, and those usually do a pretty good job. Okay? And honestly, if you take a multivitamin, which a lot of people do, you're probably getting enough at least to kind of get that over the hump. So that's that. Excretion. Your skin is all about toilet time. Right? No, just kidding. I woke you guys up, right? right? So excretion, we talked a little bit about this, right? So remember there's waste associated with your sweat, right? So that's basically bundled into the sweat. So your sweat has all these different things. Obviously it has water. We already know it has salts, right? Because we're a bunch of salt licks for the dogs. But you also have other things that you didn't know about. A lot of people don't really think about, right? You have things like urea in there, right? You have ammonia in there. You have uric acid in there. So nitrogenous bases, that's what these are. These are nitrogenous wastes. All of these. So urea is actually kind of like the base analog of the uric acid, which is an acid itself. So it's actually an organic acid.
They use it to melt ice.
What?
Ice melt.
Urea.
And it smells wonderful. But that's urea is actually, we'll see urea and AMP2 when we talk about the urinary system. It's actually a very important molecule. And a very, it's not just a waste, it's actually got a little bit more functionality to it than just like, oh, this is just trash, let's just toss it, right? So urea actually has a pretty profound and a pretty important physiological role that it plays in the urinary system. Now, obviously, you got a little bit out there, right? But this isn't your strategy. This isn't going to help you in terms of excretion. So this is the reason why we have an entire urinary system. An excretion system is because we got a lot more waste than that to deal with. So we actually have to have high output excretion. So that's just us. Other organisms, it's enough for them to excrete their waste through their skin. And they do that quite a bit, right? So like, who is it? Marine iguanas are the ones that blow the salt out of the nose and they kind of get the little salty nose crust. That's like excretion for them. They're excreting the excess salt out of them. So that's sufficient for them, right? Huh? Marine iguana?
Marine, okay,
Yeah.
that's why I was like.
Because.
Yeah.
the
You're like,
food
is there a
and
green
stuff
one
that
now?
they eat on the rocks in the ocean causes so much sweat or salt in their body that they have to excrete it out so they don't over toxicate themselves.
Mhm. And for some things like amphibians will excrete out of their skin, and that's enough for them to excrete out of their skin like that. So we have the same thing, only we have to have a separate system because the amount of waste we produce is just a ton.
We just
Right.
spit out mucus.
Yeah, we are slimy little creatures. That's yeah, I know, right? Yeah, it's like this. Yeah, we have kids, it's like mucus management, right? So it's like just lovely. Yeah, it becomes a big mucus soup. Just try not to think about what's in a pool. Just enjoy the swim. Enjoy the swim. Don't think about the fact that it's basically a human soup. A soup of. Yeah, that's why.
You have to think there is no babies or kids in a jacuzzi because that is so unhealthy for their skin.
Yeah.
Jacuzzis are like really unhealthy for the
Yeah.
temperature they're at for babies to be in, or it's way too hot.
Yeah. Yeah, fall asleep. And just got to slide underneath, right? Like they're. Okay, Burns. As in Monty Burns. Excellent. Right. So that's a little Simpson. He's my favorite character. Love Mr. Burns. Because I know a few Mr. Burns in life. But anyway, and it's like, yeah, that's it. That's it right there. Somebody got that one right on the nose. That's why I love The Simpsons, because I know one of those characters in real life. It's not like a character, it's like an actual real person. I know a Bart, I know a Homer. It's like, so I know a couple of Selma and Patty's. I know a couple of those. I don't know a Smithers, quite like a Smithers. Smithers is a little different, but it's fun. I like Smithers. Oh yeah, it happens a lot, right? So when you're taking a look at burns, right? So burns basically are damaging of your integument. That's basically what it is. And depending on how far into it gets, that's where our degree ratings goes, right? So for instance, if you're basically just burning your epidermis, then you're at a first degree level, right? So that's basically damaging your epidermis. That's the best one, by the way, because if you're lucky, that stratum basal might still be intact enough to be able to repopulate that cell. So given enough time, then they'll be able to repopulate. Now, a second degree, which can have variations to it, is basically when you start to get into the dermis, right? And of course, you're getting into different levels of the dermis. So depending on how far into the dermis you get, there's variations of second, okay? Because you can imagine how there's like a bit of a transition zone, right? You either have a really bad first or a really, gentle second. There's such a thing as a gentle burn, right? So, and then you can have a really bad second that's on the cusp of third, right? And then of course, third, basically you're burning all the way through your subcutaneous. And then what's below that?
Just bone.
Muscle.
No, muscle.
Right? So if you smell cooking meat, that means you've gone all the way third and you're getting into muscle, right? So you're cooking musculature. But if you notice something that happens in this is as you burn, and there's a kind of a phenomena that occurs, and we learned this the hard way by burning people at the stake.
I'm sorry.
you're like, what? We're burning people at the stake? Yes, back in the day when we burned people at the stake, right? There's a kind of an interesting, and you see it now, like in really bad burn victims, like ones you can't save, like where it's just like you're just overcome, and it's like, and you happen to be the unfortunate person who has to live through that moment. And that is, there it is, scarring beyond belief for those individuals. And as a Raider fan, I like the whole Henry Ruggs thing. I knew exactly how that went down. I mean, when I read the testimony of the guys who were trying to save that lady, and as a Raider fan, he was our wide receiver. So I mean, when I read that, I'm all like, oh my gosh, that is like the one thing that you never, ever, ever wish that you ever have to encounter, because it's like horrible. Yeah, well, not just the person, right? But the person who's having to sit there and watch it because they realize that there's nothing they can do. Because and this is what happened, right? They try to get them out. The seatbelts are melted. They can't cut through them. They can't get, the flames become overwhelming, and they realize that they have to back away. They have to give up. And then all that's left is the realization that as you're walking away, you realize somebody is basically dying. That is a trauma like beyond belief for anybody who's coming to the rescue, which is somebody who cares about somebody else. And that's like the worst possible thing. But in these situations, like when somebody's getting burned to death, or when you're burning somebody at the stake, right, you begin by the first degree, right? It starts to burn through the epidermis, and then it starts to move into the second degree, getting into the dermis. And at this particular point, remember, all of your pain receptors, your heat receptors, all of them are screaming at this point, right? So the pain is probably unimaginable at this particular point when you're getting it from first to second. But something very strange happens. As you start to get deeper, is you'll notice that a burn victim, and you usually hear this in the testimony of people who've had this unfortunate situation where they've had to stand by while somebody was literally burning to death, is something weird happens. It goes from screaming agony, pain, to silence. It's quiet. And you realize, and when you're kind of looking into it, if you're brave enough to do so, you realize the person's not dead yet. What happened? What happened was the fire got so deep that it actually burned and damaged the nerves. So literally what happened was they can't feel the flames anymore.
Most people that have to usually end up having some type of.
Yeah. And that's kind of what happens. And so like on a global system, it's a very eerie, I mean, because I've actually read, there's been several different accounts like this, because I read them. I'll go glut for punishment apparently. But I read through these testimonies, and every single time it's always the same. It's like an unbearable, like an unimaginable scream of pain and terror, and just beyond what we can even consider or comprehend. And then the reason why it's so eerie is because as horrible and as agonizing as the scream was, it just stops. Like it just goes away. And then at that point you realize the fire just burned the nerves. And so it's not that they're okay, it's that the nerves are gone. And that's kind of like a sobering moment because you realize, wait a minute, I know the moment when it gets to this particular depth because the screaming stops. And then you realize that's the beginning of the end. And it's not going to be long after this. And that's just like, for any kind of a decent, I mean, that's kind of makes me a little, kind of just a little trembly just thinking about it, right? Because anybody who's like in this kind of a profession, you're here probably because you actually care about people. And to even to think about something like that is just like terrorizing, like beyond comprehension, like to have to be able to see something like that. And that's kind of the reason why,
It's weird to think most people in the military have all seen that at least happen.
oh yeah, yeah. Well, people in the military have seen stuff that probably nobody in their right mind ever wants to see. So, and that's, you know, and that's, I mean, that's like a sobering moment. That's the reason why, you know, burns, like whenever I hear about burns, I mean, it's almost like it's like my entire soul just sort of drops.
Well,
It's like,
kind of that way when you have an amputee
Mhm.
or somebody who loses a body part or a limb, it comes off and they'll pick it up
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
and they'll carry it with them because there is no more pain there.
It's weird.
yeah,
In the field until actually after they go through a long stay in the hospital where they actually start getting feeling back into some of the parts of their extremity or where their extremity.
Yeah.
So that if you lose your legs, you think you start legs because it feels like it,
Mhm.
but there's nothing there.
yeah. The ghost pains idea. Yeah,
Burns are weird.
yeah. That's
Very odd.
and that's kind of so like this is like, I mean, this is the one, like everybody has their thing, right? Like the worst possible way to go in life, right? Everybody has their personal thing. For me, this is it.
Yes.
Fire is like the number one, like I would not wish this on my absolute worst enemy, like at all. And part of it is a little personal because my family, before I was born, actually went through an explosion. And it burned my dad from head to foot. He almost died because he was trying to pull everybody out. And so like I was that close. I was like, my mom was pregnant with me. And so it was like a camper. It's like before they put sulfur
Yep.
in propane.
Yep.
There was a propane leak and he didn't know it because they didn't sulfurize it and it just blew up. And in trying to pull, I mean, everybody in the family got burns.
Yep.
But I wasn't born yet, so I was lucky. But that was something like, that was just an existence. That was just something in our family that it was just something you lived with. It was like the dark cloud in the family, still is. Like there's one thing that you do not mess with. I mean, if you want to get unloaded on, play with fire, right? I mean, my dad could not actually look at a wood burning fire. He couldn't look at it because it was just, I mean, it's just psychologically scarring. It's physically scarring. It's, I mean, for everybody involved, it's like one of the most damaging psychologically, physically ways to do things to somebody, which is the reason why when I say burning people at the stake, I mean, that is probably one of the like worst things you can do to a person.
Why did it always start at the feet? Is that because it's the most sensitive? Pain as the brain and body eat up the system?
Yeah, so there's a reason why. And it's actually worse, right? Because it just shows you how inhumane the people are. Because I mean, the fire starters, if you will, they kind of got their craft from the Romans. The Romans were great. They were actually PhDs in killing people. And it depended, right? If they wanted to just be off with you, they could do it very quickly. If they wanted you to not suffer, they could do that in a very sanitary sort of a way. They're great technicians at murder. If they wanted you to suffer, they could make you linger forever in maximum pain. I mean, they knew how to make you suffer. And that's exactly what that's about. The reason why you start at the feet is because it's in the extremities and it's going to maximize your pain. You're not going to die. for a while because it's not going to get up to your visceral organs for a little while. Maybe some people passed out because of the pain. Some of them maybe didn't, right? But the thing is, as it goes slowly up, right, your feet will stop feeling things because you burned the nerves, but your legs haven't gotten there yet. So that's like, as it slowly creeps up your body, it's like you the lower parts of you stop hurting, but the upper parts of you, there's always new parts of you that are hurting. And then you basically also have this sort of sensation of like the fire in your face. So you can imagine the amount of not just pain, but the amount of terror and fear as this thing is like slowly kind of coming up, and you can kind of, and it's getting, I mean, this is absolute terror. And that's exactly what they were going for, which is the reason why I say the way they do it is sort of a window into how inhumane these people were who thought this was a good idea to do this to other human being.
This has been such a enjoyable class today.
Yeah.
Not creepy at all.
So, and that's kind of, I mean,
No,
but
love it. It's very
But see, that's a situation like where, you know, people use their knowledge of the human body and AMP and things like that for evil purposes. And that's always a thing, right? Because the knowledge you have can be used for good or for bad,
fair enough.
right? That's obviously an example of the bad. I mean, right? I mean, but
She's
I mean, you know, but it's in our power to do something good with it. So I don't know that I could actually look at something like that. Like, you know, if something like that happened today, I don't think I could actually look
I've
at
done a
something like
couple
that.
of EMT trips where I've had to pick up a burn victim. It's probably been the most worst thing I've ever, and that's one of the reasons why I had to stop recently.
Mhm.
Because it was just like, I can't. function.
Well, and that's why I said that's one of the, I mean, that's like one of the most damaging
Thankfully,
things
I
to
was
do,
not
like
firefighter, so
all the
I
way
was
around.
not
So,
going outside, but I had to have them in the ambulance. But yeah, either that, very hard.
yeah.
Only if it's like a small part. And
Yeah.
even then, it's just really hard to do. It's never, it's like cosmetic surgery. It's not really gonna look similar as well as most people that get burned. They kind of wish they just sadly probably. Yeah.
And she was involved in things. Now her arm, like one of her arms are shorter than the other, like the tissue and the damage. It's like you can see all the scars.
And that's typically, and that's part of the problem, right? I mean, fixing a burn, I mean, burns aren't really fixable. Most burn victims, you can spot them right off because you learn to live with the scars. And honestly, my dad, that's kind of the way he would, because I mean, he would, like every now and then he would work with little kids who've been burned. And these little kids would be like,
Oh,
it happened to you, didn't it? I mean, they'd spot my dad like right off. And they'd be like, you know what I'm talking about because you were there. I can see it. I can see all these scars all over you. You know what, it's like. All the way around. But each burn is different, right?
Yeah.
This is the reason why, like, I mean, I don't use the term hero lightly. I use it very sparingly. But heroics are, I mean, when I look at what the people in the burn units are doing, I mean, heroic is beyond the word for it. I mean, anything that anybody did during COVID pales by a lot in comparison to what some of these folks are doing in burn units. Because it is just, and I mean, unless you've seen it or you've experienced it, I mean, it's just, you can only imagine the type of damage psychologically, physically, emotionally it does. It just is just devastating. And they're all different, right? The way you approach them are all different. So sometimes maybe a skin graft might help a little bit. Sometimes no. You know, sometimes it's just, you know, this is just going to look like a really big, ugly scar. There's nothing we can do about it. And I mean, there's different, and the treatment of it is just about, I mean, it's really is excruciating.
I mean, to deal with the burn is excruciating because you're having to fight off infection and you're having to keep it clean. And you're talking about tissue that is just flamingly on, I mean, literally like nervous wise, pain wise, it's on fire still. I remember some of the stories my dad mentioned was, he said that what they had to do to take care of him was worse in some ways than the fire.
I could imagine it.
Because it was just, they had to scrub the tissue to keep the infection down. And it was just like, I mean, it was just unbelievable. And my dad's not a wimp.
Anyone going through that is not a win.
So to hear him say that, I'm all like, wow. So I have a lot of respect for burn unit folks. I just pray for the day when we don't need their services anymore. But I'm glad they're there when we do. So. What about getting old? How about this one? Right? Let's go from devastatingly depressing to maybe a little less depressing, right? So obviously, we already talked a little bit about this, right? I mean, so obviously with your skin, you get damage because we just wear and tear it. That's just cuts on skin, things like that. So we damage our skin as we get older, obviously. Collagen, right? I mean, we get less efficient at keeping that collagen in our dermis up to snuff, right? And so when that breaks down, that's kind of when the wrinkles kind of start to set in, right? That's kind of areas of your epidermis that are kind of slowly kind of caving in a little bit because the collagen support in there isn't quite what it used to be, right? And it's also, there's a reason why those wrinkles tend to sort of form along what I call utility lines, right? Your smile lines, right? Because your face is always wrinkling right there all the time when you smile. So the more you do that, then the higher the collagen breakdown, the slower the replacement is. So that's where your wrinkles set in, that sort of thing. So yeah, right, right. Botox, pump some plastic in there. Right, so that's kind of part of it. You know, your skin kind of dries out a little bit as you get older. It becomes a little less elastic. That's kind of a big thing. So you kind of get a little worse at your regulation, your temperature regulation, which is the reason why as you get older, you know, oftentimes you'll have a different experience with hot and cold. Like sometimes you'll be like, yeah, I feel cold all the time now, right? Because, and maybe you might remember back, it's like, well, I never used to be cold when I was 20. You know, I could run around, you know, without a shirt off or something like that out in the snowbank or something like that. What was the problem? Now it's like I'm cold when I'm like in a heated house or something like that, right? So there's differences as you get older. Now, there's not just integument, right? This is also bundled into your overall temperature physiology, which is a lot deeper and cuts across multiple visceral organ systems as well, right? So there's a bigger piece of that pie. This is just the integument system part of it.
Older people wear compression socks.
So
to regulate their blood pressure, so the temperature is a little.
So it's so it's not. There's a lot of things that get bundled in there, right? There are multifactorial issues, but typically compression socks you're usually wearing because you're starting to get a little bit of a fundamental breakdown in your fluid management and your tissues, right? So you're not able to sort of mop up the extra fluid in your tissues and get rid of it as well, and so you need a little bit of extra support to kind of keep that fluid from building up in your tissues and swelling. And so that's just, that's a little bit more of a global thing. So there's a lot of fluid management that cuts across multiple systems.
Yeah, inflammatory, yeah.
So melanocytes, right, will kind of start to change in terms of how they are functioning, right? We talked about age spots before. So that's just kind of a change in your melanin production that's just kind of getting a little more erratic as you get older, those sorts of things. So that's, and of course UV, right? UV radiation just has a general sort of a deteriorating rate. We know that, right? Anybody who's had like a piece of fabric that's been sort of sitting in a car in the sun, it gets sun faded, and then it starts to kind of disintegrate, right? Because of that's the degrading powers of the sunlight. That's kind of doing the same things happening to us. That's wonderful, right? But like in a kind of a lighter sense, right? So it's not quite as extreme as that, but the same general thing is happening. And so that's just, we get all that from just being alive on this planet, right? That's just welcome to planet Earth. You're alive, and that's just kind of part of it, part of the deal.
So that was a little more depressing and disturbing than I intended it to be,
Important stuff.
but that's, yeah, but, I mean, that's, I mean, I know it's a little, I mean, it's a little problematic, but I mean, to be honest with you, that's also one of the reasons why we do what we do. I mean, when you're talking about somebody like having to pick up a burned body, or, I mean, that's the reason why you're here. That's the reason why you want to help somebody with that, because if there's anything you can do to keep some of these things from happening to somebody else, and then it's like, it's time well spent, that's the reason why we're here.
So basically, though, in spite of all these hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cosmetics that they sell, it's really not good at
In the end, yeah, that's a very fatalistic way to look at that. That's true, right? Well, I don't know. I mean, if they screw it up, yeah. Right? I mean, it's like, but I mean,
It doesn't matter of how much you apply it,
Yeah.
like if you're someone who's doing it 3 times a day, brand new foundation, everything full face, then yeah, you're probably getting a little more damage than most people are. But if you're doing it like once a week, maybe once a day even so, and it's not like a full ass face, then sorry for my language, then. you're
that was
probably-
recorded. Just saying, that wasn't me saying that. We got you.
Send it off to the head.
All the actors still look
Yeah.
like.
Look at Jennifer Anderson.
22, you know?
Jennifer
Affleck.
Anderson.
He doesn't look like he's almost 60.
Did you see the Friends reunion? All of them are
She
nasty.
said close up. No, not good.
Oh,
Well-
Jennifer Anderson, please, that whole body is fake.
Yeah.
Fair enough. I said Jennifer Anderson. I'm the one who said it.
Well-
She said absolutely not to that one.
Well, I mean, that's kind of, well, the problem is that's your industry, right? I mean, so part of that is assisted by chemicals and plastic.
Well, they say some of it's.
But-
type material. that-
Yeah, and you have to, right? Because you're not going to get a job in Hollywood if you look like a 90-year-old.
I remember.
I
one of
mean,
her
it's
male
like,
actors
that's,
started smoking cigarettes. So
Right, so
much.
you're trying to
Yeah.
look like Bette Midler, you just can't do it.
Very true.
or my favorite is Robert Redford,
Oh, that's such a great
Right.
one.
because he was one of those ones where like in his 40s, he was all like, hey, that's pretty cool. And then it's like in his 50s, it's like, holy mackerel. It's like the whole face just came down at once, like an avalanche, right? I mean, it's just like,
You know who watches Jamie Lee Curtis, 64.
Hmm.
I would say she looks great for her age, for a 64-year-old woman.
yeah, I mean, you can certainly prolong it. You can prolong it. There's things you can do to make it better, but in the end, it's all gonna come off.
Not Jamie Lee
Right.
Curtis. Not really Jamie Lee Curtis. If you ever see her, she's never been one to wear like. it's
Yeah,
not
she's not been a makeup person at
No,
all,
no.
which is really interesting. I think that's just her.
That's just been
That's
her
her.
ever. Even if you look on her on TV shows like
Well, Demi Moore's
Halloween,
not a big
barely.
Yeah,
barely
there's some of them.
Demi Moore's not a big-
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alicia Keys is another one. She doesn't really do a lot of the
Oh, yeah.
overdone stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yep, yep, yep.
And she looks great.
She's
Yeah.
absolutely gorgeous. Alicia Keys.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, well, you
Yeah,
know, we
Denise.
have that little slight to say about us, and I'm not gonna say it here because I don't get in trouble.
Here, I got it recorded. Go ahead and say
I
it,
was
Denise.
about
You're like, and it's gonna be posted on YouTube. isn't
Oh.
it?
See, this makes
I'll
sense.
just say, be don't.
Me and
see.
Evan went over this the other day. No wonder I
We
didn't
go with
understand.
that.
Fair enough.
Me and Evan went over this the other day and I was very confused why I didn't understand it because I thought we went over it.
We get spongy bones.
What, bones?
Yeah. me
Oh,
and
yeah,
Evan
no, we
were
haven't
going
gone over it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't gone over it yet.
I
Okay,
thought it was really stupid.
this is 6. So we're starting off with bone physiology now,
Nope.
to go along with our bone anatomy. So we're there. So let's go ahead and take, first of all, let's take a look at the functions, right? So we take a look at the functions. There's a lot of things here that we know about. Obviously, support. Right? Bones are hard and rigid, so they basically give you support, right? They basically give you tissue support. They are connective tissue, so that's kind of what you do as a connective tissue. So you basically do support. Protection, right? Where do you get protection from? Right, your helmet. So you got a natural football helmet,
right? So you're basically protecting your brain. That's a really big one. But there's others, aren't there? Your ribs, your rib cage. Why is that there? Yeah, right. Your heart and lungs. That's there for that one. So those are all protective in nature, right? So protection is a big thing. Movement, is that an easy one to come up with? Sure, right? If you want to be able to walk, you better have something to walk on, right? Because if you didn't have any bones, you just basically look like a beanbag chair, right?
Like that.
So, yeah, right. So you want to basically be able to move around. So this is a huge part of your ambulatory strategy. Of course, you need a little something other than bones to be able to do that, right? That's the next chapter. But here's then these are what I call the structural functions. So now what about the physiological functions, right? That's what these guys are here. So these are the physiological ones. So what are we doing physiologically? Well, first of all, your bone is a storehouse. So you can store lots of stuff. Well, what are you going to store there? Well, how about calcium, right? That's one. Remember, you need calcium not just for bones, but also for muscles. We're going to see the role of calcium plays in muscles, which is actually critical. It's a storage facility for your phosphates as well. Why are phosphates important? Well, obviously for bone, but phosphate is also important in like building of nucleotides, right? Because you have a phosphate group in your nucleotides that builds your DNA. So if you're doing active cell division and you need to make more DNA, then you need to actually add phosphates to those nucleotides to be able to build that. So it's nice to have a little storehouse of phosphates to go along with that. And then also blood production. Some of you guys probably came up with this one, right? Your bone marrow, right? This is basically where all of your blood cells, both red blood cells, RBCs, and white blood cells, WBCs, are all going to be made in your bone marrow. So your bone is going to be the locale for a huge chunk of your cardiovascular system, right? So when you take a look at AMP2, there's actually multiple chapters associated and focused on the cardiovascular system. The first one is blood, right? Blood and blood cells and white blood cells and things like that. That's all part of the cardiovascular system. The second one is obviously the heart, the structure of the heart. And the third one is the vasculature. So all three of those are separate chapters in AMP2, but they're all part of the cardiovascular system. So now what you're basically saying is you're tethering a significant component of the cardiovascular system with your skeletal system. So now what you've just done is you've basically taken two, what looks like very different systems, and you've linked them together physiologically. Okay. And so these are really important. And, oh, by the way, it's more than just the cardiovascular system, isn't it? Because white blood cells are part of what? The immune system. So really, the skeletal system is linking together how many systems? The skeletal system, the muscular system, right? Because that's ambulation, right? Movement. Then it's also linking together your cardiovascular system because of the blood component and also the immune system, right? So those are four different systems that are very different, have very different roles that are all linked together. And linking them all together, it's the skeletal system. This is the reason why whenever you're studying AMP, it's artificial for us to be able to study these things in isolation as a system on its own self. Really what we do is we just study that for convenience because that's easier for us to keep track of. But in reality, the way anatomy and physiology works is you develop a system and you connect it to all these other systems and you blur the lines. So all of your physiology is integrated with other systems. So it's not possible to damage one system without having consequences on multiple other systems. You see this a lot in physiology. Okay. This is the reason why it's almost impossible to treat a particular system in isolation. You're oftentimes having to treat multiple systems at a time because of this cut across. So in the skeletal system, technically speaking, we also have cartilage in there, even though it's not bone, right? But we have to toss it somewhere. So it goes under this one because this is sort of like little brother, right? So if bone is actually big brother, then cartilage is like little brother. And we have the same conventions, right? So if we take a look at cartilage, remember, we had three different types of cartilage. We learned about this one in chapter 4, right? So we had hyaline cartilage, we had fiber cartilage, and we had elastic cartilage, right? And the dominant type is by far the hyaline cartilage. So like if you were to point to cartilage, I hope that wasn't recorded, but if that was, if we were to point to a cartilage source, you're more likely going to point to a type of hyaline cartilage, right? And so the cartilage itself, we learned about this in chapter 4. The only way that it differs is by what you lay down in the matrix, like the different protein fibers and things of that nature. But basically, they're all sort of just relative ratios of sort of collagenous fibers versus elastic fibers. Okay. Now, we also learned about the different cells associated with connective tissues, didn't we? We also learned that there is basically the blast cells, in this case, chondroblasts. So they're laying down the cartilaginous. So these are the initial formers. So they lay down new matrix. Then you have the chondrocytes. The chondroblasts basically will grow up. And when they grow up, they're going to form the full-fledged mature cells, the chondrocytes, and their job is to maintain, right? See, these guys are the maintenance crew. They maintain the matrix. And so that's basically this piece. And this is just like the bone, right? So you had basically a little hollowed out area of your matrix within which the chondrocytes live, right? That lacuna. So that same lacuna structure is what we see with bone and with cartilage. The only thing that differs is the matrix itself, right? And then around that, you have a liner. And so that liner is the in this case, chondrium. So the chondrium for chondro is the root for cartilage. Peri means around. So perichondrium is the layer around the cartilage. And there's usually two different layers to any kind of a perichondrial component. There's an outer connective tissue layer. So this is like an outer layer. And then there's an internal, what's called a cellular layer. That's true for any of these layers. The perichondrium has an internal and an external layering system. So does the periosteum, right? In this case, the same basic idea, the liner, but in this case, it surrounds bones. And so what are the functions of these? Well, let's take a look at it. The outer layer is going to basically have no blood vessels, so it's avascular. All cartilage is avascular, basically. But nerves can penetrate into it, right? That's to kind of and blood vessels, right? So they can kind of, they're not inside, but they're kind of on the surface area. So they kind of basically stop short. And then all the nutrients get to these chondrocytes by diffusion. So they just kind of diffuse into the cartilaginous matrix, the lacuna, where they can, feed those chondrocytes, right? Which is one of the reasons why cartilage itself as a tissue is not extensive, because diffusion can only go across short distances. That means you're limited in size, okay? So you can't get very big because you're gonna outstrip your supply lines, right? And you would die. The inner layer basically is what we call a cellular layer. This is where your chondroblasts are. So if you basically needed to, say, for instance, lay down new connective tissue or some new cartilaginous matrix, then you have an inner layer of cells, chondroblasts, that can do that when it's damaged, right? So the outer layer, this connective tissue sheath region, is really critical because it's protecting the inner cellular layer, which is kind of the physiological layer, but it also allows you to be able to interweave your cartilage with other connective tissues. So you can kind of connect those together with surrounding connective tissues, and therefore you can get this to become a whole. So it's not like, you got a piece of cartilage in isolation. That cartilage is usually embedded and interwoven with the collagenous fibers of the surrounding connective tissues. So you can kind of weave it into the body, right? And that kind of gives it some stability and some connection. That's one of the reasons why in all these structures, you see this as a common theme, whether you're talking about blood vessels in AMP2 or the periosteum or the perichondrium. Oftentimes you'll always see an outer area like the hair sheath, that outer connective tissue sheath is made of connective tissue. Why? because the collagenous fibers of that connective tissue sheath can weave together with the collagenous fibers of the surrounding connective tissue and connect it, weave it into that surrounding tissue. That's the way you anchor stuff into. By the way, that's also the way that your tendons are connected to your bones. They're not just glued on there like a double-sided tape, right? What happens is the way you do it is you actually weave the collagenous fibers of your tendons, which we saw, right? That's that dense regular connective tissue. You actually weave those collagenous fibers with the collagenous fibers in the connective tissue layer of the periosteum, and you weave those together. So your ligaments and your tendons are actually woven into the periosteal liner of the bones. That's how they connect to the bones, right? So it's not like a clean break. It's interwoven. It's like a braid. It's braided into your bone. And that's pretty cool. So cartilage then obviously will then underneath the pericardium, you usually have your cartilage, and then you'll have articular cartilage, which is associated with joints. So that's your cartilage at joint. We'll talk about that in the next chapter, which is joints. And then there's two different ways to grow. So these are growth patterns. And we'll talk about the growth patterns next time. You have appositional growth and interstitial growth. This is how you grow cartilage. We'll talk a little bit about these growth patterns next time, which will be after the lab exam. So just like usual, we'll begin the day on Tuesday with the lab exam. Once we finish, I'll kind of clean things up a little bit, and then we'll settle down for our lecture.
Oh my God, my God, it's so bad sitting down right now.